What's up, everybody? Welcome to the channel. I'm Tyler. We're going to be going over 3406B, C, they're basically the same, fuel pump assembly. We'll go through basically everything from an empty pump housing to a complete assembly, including the governor, but we'll go over component identification and assembly. There's not a lot of videos on YouTube that cover any of this, and these pumps really aren't that hard to rebuild or complicated, really. So we'll go over everything and assemble this pump. So this is a plunger and barrel assembly. Goes here in the pump, 6 of them. It's the business end of the pump. Plunger, barrel, spring, bonnet. There's a check valve and a spring inside. And if you pulled one out when you were disassembling your pump, and I realized the disassembly video wasn't a precursor to this video, but it got lost. So anyway, if you pull one out and you're just changing a bonnet O-ring or something and you completely take it apart, they're very simple to reassemble. There's nothing real special here. This will fit down inside that. There is a cut here, and it will fit into that little retainer. And then obviously you need to be very careful. These are machine surfaces. It's, you want to be really, really careful when you reassemble. That'll slide back in there. Push a little harder, the snap or the spring will just kind of snap onto this barrel, and you can set that down. Or, well, what I like to do, this clip keeps the top and the bottom together. So there's a notch here. Just hook that clip on there and then pull it all the way up. And then you can take your bonnet, put your spring in your bonnet, put your check valve in your bonnet. And this is more of an art than anything, but you hold that and you push down, kind of hook that spring, and then you got to keep everything kind of compressed. There we go. And eventually you'll get it to sit down and retain everything, because there is spring weight on that for the check valve. This is a used one that came out of this pump. Well, technically the pump over there, but anyway, if you disassemble one on accident, they're very easy to reassemble. So if we look over here, this is the original pump housing, the original cam. When I disassembled this pump, we were just rebuilding it because we're rebuilding the engine, but lo and behold, this pump was dying. You can see the big ditch cut in the #1 cam lobe right here. And you can see the lifter took on a whole bunch of damage. Generally speaking, when you overhaul one of these pumps, the cam and lifters are reusable. You want to inspect everything really thoroughly, but normally you remove the cam and lifters and they run again. Also, the rack is generally always reusable. This one took on damage from #1 when it was falling apart and it was beating that lifter around. And it damaged the bore in this injection pump housing, so this housing is no good. So the first thing you want to do for fuel pump assembly, well, when you disassemble it, you remove all the plugs. There's little plugs and fittings, especially on the back side of the pump housing. These are all oil galleys in the housing. Oil's pumped through this to supply the governor, because a lot of the governor functions rely on oil pressure. And so when you disassemble this, because you're going to completely overhaul it, you want to remove all of your plugs and thoroughly clean out all of these passages. This thing needs to be spotless when you go to reassemble. You don't want dirt in anything. So the first thing you would do is install all of these O-ring Boss plugs back in their holes, which if you get, I recommend getting the gasket set from Caterpillar. There's normally 2 when you look up a serial number. One of them is for the pump housing, more or less, and it won't have any of your governor gaskets or O-rings or anything like that. So if you have a good Cat parts guy wherever you're at, And he offers 2 different gasket sets. You want to look at the bill of materials or what's in it. One of the pump gasket sets will have several, have 3 lip seals in it and just a lot more items. If you're going to rebuild an entire pump, get that gasket set, because otherwise you'll have to buy like 60 individual O-rings and gaskets, and it's a pain. If you get the bigger one, they're very complete as far as gaskets and O-rings. So I'm going to throw these plugs in and then we'll move on. We got the plugs in, one here, one here, one here, one here. Use lots of motor oil on the O-rings. Be careful when you put them in. Look at the like the flange of the fitting when you tighten it, and make sure it didn't squirt the O-ring out. I don't know why, but even with the right part number, right O-ring, all that, lots of motor oil on the O-ring. Once in a while, these ones are troublesome. When you screw them in, it'll peel part of the O-ring. I've had to try 2 or 3 O-rings sometimes. And you don't want to find out when this is installed that one of these leaks, because it'll be oil pressure, and it's, yeah, you got to pull the pump back off to replace it. But just use caution. So now we can lube the cam bearings with motor oil. There's one here, one on the other end, and one in the center of the pump. Generally, they don't need replaced. They're really good bearings, and they usually don't have any wear in them. I mean, if you had an engine with catastrophic metal failure and she kept on running, there might be some scarring in there, but normally these cam bearings are not replaced. So we'll get our new pump cam and we'll lube it all up, and then you drop the pump cam. We'll stand the pump up on end. We'll stack these items on the nose of the pump. This is what your timing advance would bolt to later on when you go to put the advance on. And then we also have some thrust washers that are going to go up against this for when this is installed. So we'll get all these parts lubed up, and we'll slip this together, and we'll stand the pump up and throw the cam in there. All right, so we got everything lubed up, ready to go. One thing I'll show you while it's out, because it's a little more obvious. When you go to pin this pump for timing purposes, for installation, when the pump is installed, or excuse me, when the cam is installed in the pump housing, this is the timing pin that you would use to pin it on number 1. And this is the notch on this. It's not a lobe, this I don't know, round part of the cam. This is the notch that you would be engaging when it's installed, when you're going to pin it on number 1. So later on when it's in, you can't really see in the hole, but you can actually tell what we're doing. You'd be spinning the pump by hand, probably, trying to locate number 1. And as you turn the pump, you'll have your pressure on the timing pin, and as it turns, you'll drop in, and that will lock the pump on number 1, top dead center. So, that's loud. The front of the cam, in different cams with different part numbers, they have different bearing configurations. This one has the thicker thrust washer and the fairly thin bearing and thick thrust washer. So the first thing we'll do is we'll drop this drive on there very carefully. And then you know what? It's going to be a lot easier. I keep forgetting. If you just drop those in the housing. So we'll just leave those in there. You got a bearing in the middle, thrust on each side. Drop it in the little hole. And then very carefully install the pump cam. So I did set it up on a block, which helps. The pump cam actually sticks out of the bottom of the pump during normal operation, But for assembly, gives you room to get your fingers out of there. You can thread a bolt in here, put some bolts in here, whatever if you want to, give you something to hang on to. I like doing it that way. Okay, so the next step would be to drop in all your lifters. There's a guide cut into the back side of the lifter. It keeps the lifter true in the bore so it can't turn on the pump cam, and obviously you need the pump cam going this way across the roller. So when you drop it in, you have to locate this slot on a dowel that is down inside the pump housing. You can get a look at it down in there. But you'll see a dowel in the bottom and a dowel towards the top, which is used for the plunger and barrel. But when you drop this in, you have to line up the dowel. And it's pretty obvious. I mean, it's real simple. The other thing about the lifter is there is a tiny quill sticking out of it. And when you install your plunger and barrel, this little slot has to engage that little quill. We'll go over that when we drop them in there, but just something to note so you know it's there and you don't ruin it. But I'm going to lube all these up really good and drop them down in the holes, and then we'll move on. So I got 5 lifters installed. We're just going to lube this one. I like to pump oil down in there alongside the roller and then physically make sure the roller spins free. These are new lifters because this has a new cam. I don't want to put used lifters on a new cam. But like with any, well, these are new, but Cat reman product, like rocker arms and things like that, always make sure the lifter rolls. I've got an E-model and C15 reman rocker arms where the lifter would not roll. You could push it against the bench and push as hard as you can, and you could not get the lifter to roll. And then the next one out of the box, you can just spin it like no problem. So always look at even new parts, reman parts, make sure that they work properly. Because if this is locked up because somebody squeezed this too hard or something like that, you'll wipe out a pump cam, you'll destroy something, and good luck arguing with the service department. But the notch is going to go on the back side, the same as where the dowel is located. And you just drop it, and it goes down in. And then to verify that you have all of them in the right spot and you can move to the next step, you can simply spin the pump cam and look at every single lifter. They'll go up and they'll go back down. And there we go. See, I didn't have number 6 all the way down. And if they all go up and down as you spin it, you're golden. Time to move on. So the next step would be to install the rack. So the rack, the plunger and barrel, as it gets dropped down in there, this sits in there like this with the teeth facing the plunger and barrel. And the teeth on this rack, or on the plunger and barrel, engage. And as you pull it into, or let's see here, I don't remember which way is which. We'll cover that later. But you go into or out of fuel, it turns the pump. The pump has 2 scrolls. This is a dual scroll plunger and barrel, and that determines how much fuel gets pushed out of the top, whether this is over here and no fuel or over here and full fuel. So we'll take this rack and we'll lube her up and we'll put her in there. There's a brass bushing, if you want to look at. There's a round brass bushing in the back of the pump. And then in the front, which I probably can't show you on camera because of the angle, but inside this hole, if you get a flashlight and look back in there, there's another brass bushing that this I guess oblong or funny shaped part of the rack would engage, and that is to keep the rack, square with your plungers and barrels so that it cannot roll out of position. And we'll just put plenty of oil on there. And I've already oiled both of the bushings in the pump. And so we'll take this with our teeth facing the left, and we'll just very carefully install it. And got lucky, I nailed it the first go. And if you look in that hole, you can see that the rack is traveling, back and forth. And it slides super easy. If you put this in and it takes weight to slide this back and forth, something is wrong. This thing needs to just glide and float in there. When we put the plungers and barrels in, these are new. The boxes said reman, but when Cat runs out of actual reman, they give you new and they put reman numbers on it. So these are 100% new assemblies. I use aftermarket plungers and barrels also, but what I've noticed about the Caterpillar ones especially is these don't turn hard, but they have some weight to them, and I assume it's probably the assembly anti-rust stuff that Caterpillar probably puts on these to keep them fresh in the box for years. But if you want to, you can disassemble these or just pull the plunger out of the barrel, and you could lube it up and just work it with motor oil or diesel or whatever you want, because it's going to be diesel inside there the rest of its life, and get these to turn a little easier. I'm not concerned about it because I know how the rack works and everything, but if you want a little bit easier rack sliding when you're assembling, you might want to disassemble them and lube them up. The next thing we have to put in now that the rack is installed would be our machine spacers. So this galley in the side of the pump has these small holes. Cat has a fancy name for them, but it's just a little piece of pipe. And this is how fuel gets around the body of the barrel and gets in so that it can be pumped. There's no like lip seal or O-ring or anything underneath of this. So you have to picture this is all steel inside of here. There's no O-rings or anything on the bottom. What Cat came up with is a machined washer, and these work. I've never had one leak. Basically, this drops down into the hole and it sits on a ledge, and it sits on the bottom of this pump assembly. When you tighten the nut, and there is an O-ring on top where you put the nut down, and you put weight on this metal surface, this makes a fuel seal. It's machined flat and fancy enough that it makes a seal, and fuel isn't able to just run down past the pump into the cam housing and therefore into the crankcase of the engine. So when I take these out, I very delicately clean them, and I keep them in order in orientation. So when I took this is a core pump that I found because that pump housing is junk. But I kept the spacers, the correct orientation, out of the same hole. It may not make a difference because you can buy these from Cat, and they obviously weren't machine matched to this pump, but I do. It makes me feel good on the inside, and I've never had one leak. So they have to go around this little pipe, fuel pipe, whatever you want to call it. So I usually drop them in, and then you roll them to that side, and you wiggle a little bit, and they'll sit nice and flat in there. So just kind of drop them in like that, and then push them over, give them a little wiggle, and they're sitting on the bottom. Okay, so the timing pin that you would use for pinning the pump on number 1 is also used in this hole in the top of the pump. And if you want to come over here, look in this hole, and in the rack inside there, you'll see a slot cut in the rack. So you drop this pin, your timing pin, in this top hole, and it'll engage the rack in that slot. You grab the rack at the back of the pump, and you just pull it up against that pin. I mean, it's just resting there. There's no weight or anything. And what that does up here is it centers the rack. So now the teeth of the rack are centered in the lifter, and then you're able to drop in a pump. So this is really redneck. I always thought Cat probably made a tool for this, but to my knowledge they don't. You have to align this slot with the center of this slot, because there's that little quill that's in the bottom in the lifter. And you align this, and then there's also a dowel, which is your fuel feed dowel that sticks out in the pump housing. That locates this and keeps it from turning, like when you tighten the nut or loosen the nut that retains it. And then this locates you on your rack. So what I do is I hold it up and you eyeball it, because I don't know of a better way to do it. And now that you got it eyeballed, you look for any one of your lifters that's all the way down. You can put them in with the lifter up on a high spot on the cam, but it's more difficult. So we'll just do number one. Number one is all the way down, and located right here on this plane, right here. So you're eyeballing it, and you very carefully drop your pump in. Now, some guys might be like, well, how do I know if it's all the way in? By feel is the best way I can describe it. If you are engaged and the rack is centered and you hit the teeth right and all of that stuff, you should be able to pull this pin out. Now, I know it's not tight or anything, but we're not going to hurt anything either. You pull the pin out and you can run the rack one way or the other. And you can see this is twisting left and right. So we are engaged, and we are physically turning the teeth on the bottom of the pump. So I'm going to put that back in, and I'm going to push the rack to the rear so that I know this is centered. And then you have your bonnet nut. And these really cool pink O-rings. One thing, if you do use an aftermarket gasket set, that's fine. Most of the gaskets and the O-rings are fine. Get these from Caterpillar. I don't know what the aftermarket is using for O-rings as far as these bonnet O-rings. They like to leak anyway. I mean, not immediately, but it's a common issue on these pumps is to have fuel gushing out the top. Get Caterpillar O-rings. These are the best quality that I have found. What I like to do is I like to anti-seize the threads on this, and then I lube this surface with engine oil and this surface with a little bit of engine oil. And with these, you just have to apply a really slight amount of pressure, if any. If the pump is all the way down, like the cam lobe is all the way down, and then they simply thread in there. You do need, this is the only real special tool that you have to do this pump. Everything else is, well, I suppose you need the timing pin. And this cat calls this a wrench. Part number is 8Tom5287. I think it's more like a socket, but whatever. And that would engage the splines in this nut, and that's how you're able to torque this bonnet nut down. So I'll get all of these anti-seized and lubed up, and we'll drop them in, and I'll show you how I check to see if all the teeth are synchronized properly. It's not the way Cat tells you to do it, but it hasn't failed me yet. So we'll go through that, and let me get these all ready to go. All right, so got our O-ring lubed up. We have the rack pulled to the rear. We've moved it. You know, we know everything's good, so we just drop the O-ring in there and grab your bonnet nut, or I think Cat calls it a bushing, but whatever. It's like a nut. Get a little Earl on there, and you kind of center it on the O-ring. You can get all hung chowed on the O-ring sometimes when you go to put that nut on. It's actually only happened to me like once or twice, but it has happened. So you drop that stuff on there, and then 15/16, put a little down pressure on it. It'll grab, and away we go. And then I just make them good and snug for now. They're not going to go anywhere. These do need to be torqued. It's a Cat spec. It's a Cat spec. So it's 180 plus or minus 10 foot-pounds. Like any good Cat spec, they give you a nice big window to work with. I always go to the high side, so 190 foot-pounds, but we don't really need to tighten that right now. It's seated, it's positioned, it ain't going anywhere, and it's fine. So now, to make sure that when you drop that in there, your rack was in the correct position, and, well, you don't got something really screwed up. You need to make sure that this plunger and barrel is centered on the rack, because you have the rack and your plunger and barrel and they engage and there is a center position. But you can accidentally install them advanced or retarded as far as how much fuel it has. So we need to make sure that we are centered. This is not in the book, but I figured this out. If you look in the top of the pump housing, which we'll just tip it over right now so you can see a little easier. We will set it on something there. If you look in there, you can see the rack at the bottom. And what I have found, and it might be kind of hard to see because of the glare, is if you push the rack all the way that way, as far as it will let you travel with your finger, the last tooth is almost at center line of the lifter. And then if you pull the rack back the other way, it's the same thing. The last tooth is almost at center line of the lifter. If you move the rack back and forth, and your last tooth is aligning with center line of the lifter, or really darn close to it, then you have this pump is timed correctly to the rack. You don't have to worry about it being advanced or retarded. If you do have it advanced, like it's into fuel one tooth, it's not going to run away, it's not going to explode or anything, but you will know when you start it, because you'll have one cylinder hammering, it'll be knocking, and you'll have a puff of black smoke, and you'll know something is wrong. If you have it the other way, out of fuel, you'll have a dead cylinder. It'll just be a miss that is not going to go away until you correct the condition. So we'll put the other 5 in there. And of course, when you drop the last one in, you no longer can see the rack. And what I do there is on the back of the pump housing, where the rack is, I pull the rack all the way out, and I use a caliper, and I measure off of this down to the brass bushing. And that gives me a dimension for this direction of rack travel. And I just lock it down and I record that direction, how far it was. Did you hear the door shut? That was weird. The other way, you push the rack all the way in, because you want to make sure you have the correct amount of travel both directions. You push it all the way in before you have your last pump in, and you know you're centered. And you look in here and you drop your timing pin. If you drop your timing pin and it is just barely not going to engage, you can see the cut in there. That is the correct amount of travel that direction. CAT has all kinds of fancy specs and procedures and all kinds of garbage for this, but all you're doing is making sure your teeth are centered. If you are off a tooth, it will be a noticeable amount to where it's, you know, it's not in the thousands. You're going to see it. I hope that made sense. I don't know. So we'll put this back in. You have to have your rack centered. So you drop your pin and you pull the rack all the way to the rear, and you look in the window and you make sure that that's resting in that notch in the rack with the rack pulled to the rear. And you drop in the rest of them. Like I said before, make sure that the pump is on a low spot. Well, now that we have one in here, this is easy to turn until we start compressing this one. And then you can't hardly turn it anymore by hand. I use channel locks. This gear is hard as a diamond in an ice storm. So channel locks, they won't even scratch that thing. And it makes it to where you can actually bar this thing around. You can put a couple bolts in the back. You can put a couple of little bolts in here and use like a screwdriver or something like that to lever this thing around. I like channel locks. So I'll drop the rest of these in here, and then I'll show you what I mean with the rack travel with the caliper and whatnot, and then we'll just keep moving on. So I got 5 in here, and we're going to look in this hole and verify that I have all 5 correctly timed, which, like I said before, we'll just look through here and we'll physically move the rack with one finger in here, one on the back. You look down at the rack, you look at that last tooth, push it all the way to the rear of the pump, and the last tooth, it is kind of hard to see down in there, the last tooth is almost centered up on the lifter. And you push it the other way, and the last tooth is almost centered on the lifter. Then I know all of my timing for these 5 is in the right position. Like I say, if you're off a tooth, you will be limited on rack travel because there's only so many tooth slots, and you'll run into a solid part of the rack and won't travel one way. So we got that figured out. Before I drop the last one in, I'm going to take the rack, I'm going to push it all the way to the rear as far as it'll go. Take my caliper and then touch the bushing and push this in and just touch the end of the rack. So 0.89 inches of travel out the rear. So when I get the last one in, all I have to do is verify I have that, and I know that the last one got put in correctly. And then on the front, to make sure we have good rack travel in this direction, I'll push the rack all the way forward, and I'll drop that timing pin down in there, and I'll physically look at the pin, and I realize that the pin just barely won't drop into that slot. Like I said, if you're off a tooth, this will be a noticeable difference, but if it's like that, when you get done with your 6th one, then you're good to go and you can move on. So we'll drop the last one in, the old eyeball alignment. Oh, edit. Okay, good and tight. So we'll pull our pin out, push the rack all the way to the rear, check that we touched the brass bushing, and we touched that. Perfect. So we know that we're not off a tooth this direction. Shove it all the way to the front. And there's my light. And we'll drop this pin in there. And we're barely not into the notch. So number 6 is timed correctly. We don't have to worry about the rack being out of time or pump being out of time. We don't really need that in there anymore. So now we can move on to governor assembly. Okay, so we'll go into governor assembly. There's a lot of little parts that kind of are sub-assembled or assembled prior to putting larger components together. This is the governor drive shaft. It's actually a tack drive. The end of this is squared off. In an older truck, you may have a cable that connects to the back of the governor, and this is what would spin and make your tachometer function. We need to disassemble this and steal the spring and these 2 little caps. The bearing will be thrown away and replaced, and then there's also some very, very small snap rings. This drive shaft is usually replaced also because on the tip of it there is a lip seal that rides in the back of the governor housing, and they always eat a nice big groove in these drive shafts. So it's a good item to replace when you're in there, the shaft, the bearing, and the snap rings. So we'll get our new one set up and ready to go. The governor drive shaft, it has 2 oh, I can't remember what Cat calls them. They're like a little top hat looking thing. One on each side of this spring. There are two little tiny clips. One you'll slide down this end of the shaft, and then one, when you compress all of this, you slide the clip down this end of the shaft. When the clip's gone, this sits about that tall, so you do have to compress all this to assemble it. New bearing, new retaining clips, new drive shaft. And for now, that's as far as we'll go on that. We need to put the flyweights and the thrust and all this stuff on the back of the pump right now. This is the flyweight carrier, and these are flyweights. So this is the updated flyweight. This is probably what came in most pumps, the original flyweight. The difference is how wide the foot is on the flyweight. The original ones had this narrow little foot and this really sad little washer that is what the flyweight pushed on. The update to this design, which this ended in failure of your governor housing most of the time because the foot was too small, the wear surface was too small, it was a bad idea. The update is this larger foot and this much larger surface for this thing to wear on. And you'll see how it goes together in a minute, but this is an updated setup. The flyweight is a 1198699. I don't remember the race. You have to talk to a parts guy. He'll figure it out. But this is the updated parts. So you got to assemble. Where's my Earl? There it is. The flyweights to the carrier, and you simply drop them in there, and then you put your dowel pin, which retains it, in through that side hole. And I use an O-ring pick to push the dowel the rest of the way in. It'll be centered from here to here because a bolt has to pass through on both sides. That's what keeps that pin from flying out of there. So we'll put all four of these on. So the riser is what is going to hold the races in this small bearing here, and it's what's going to push against the flyweights. So to assemble the riser, very simple. Use a little Earl on both sides of your washer. Stick that on there. There is a bearing that rides in the middle. Lube it up. Got enough lube on my hands. So that is your stack. Two thrusts with a bearing in the middle. And then this nifty little retaining clip here, which if you have fingernails is not hard to install. Oh. So I got the clip on there. These can't come off now. It's going to end up being installed on that shaft here in a little bit. But we need the shaft. We have to assemble all the shaft now, actually. I lied. So we'll put some oil inside of the riser. And on the outside, just lots of oil. Oil is good. And then we'll put some oil on there. No problem. And then you have this guy. So this guy is called the spring seat, according to the book. You'll put a little Earl on that. These little washers right here are actually, they're what Cat calls them seals. And they will go inside the riser tube later. I've never seen them wore out or damaged or anything, and I always look at them. I've actually never replaced them. Maybe I should have, but never had an issue. I normally never disassemble this piece. A guy could pretty easily. There's a snap ring. You could take it apart, but I've never found a reason why. Never seen anything wore out on them before. So we'll take this stuff and we'll slide that baby on there, and then we'll slide this on here, and then all of this has to go in this little hole. And you'll see the shaft, she's poking out the back. There's a small dowel, and this is a wear item. It's a 4 Nancy 9019. And this little dowel gets put into the shaft right there. and then you simply turn the shaft and locate it in there. Now it's locked and it has to spin with the camshaft because that dowel is in there. This will no longer, you know, just do what it wants in there. So, so now before we put that, the flyweight carrier on, you got your rear thrust bearings for the pump cam. So the same thing, lots of oil on everything. And you'll have a bearing sandwiched in between two thrusts, and you can go ahead and just slide that onto the back of the pump cam, and the oil stiction should keep her stationary. Now you can carefully install the flyweight carrier and the shaft. Red Loctite on these little bolts that hold everything together. You do not want this baby coming loose. So put a little red Loctite on there, and we're going to verify. It's kind of a trick. You got to kind of hold the back, hold the top, make sure all your dowel pins stayed in place. You can't remove any of your flyweights. They won't come out when it was rolling around on the bench. And once you drop these bolts in there, the little dowels that hold the flyweights in place cannot fall out. And it is 1/4 inch 12 point. There's no location for this. Just line up your holes. There's no like exact spot it has to go. There's no oil feed ports or anything like that. So line up your bolts, keep your shaft pulled out, and then there she is. Oop, oop, oop. You gotta kind of hold these up. It's a bit of a pain. Just run them down in there, and then you gotta tighten them. There's probably a torque spec. Don't know what it is. I use this method. Click. Haven't had one come loose yet. So to make sure we didn't smash anything, excuse me, if you grab the shaft, it is going to wiggle in and out just a little bit, and that's normal. And it'll probably rock side to side just a tiny bit. And as long as it does that, you didn't get something all cross-eyed and sideways in there. And your pump will also have some thrust forward and back, not just a tiny bit. And you can pry it back and forth. And if you're really paying attention, you can see that it moves a tiny, tiny, tiny bit. And I can slide the bearing, and I can move the races, so we know nothing is smashed and you're not, you don't got something screwed up. Now we'll assemble the governor servo. I've never seen this little arm thing go bad or fall out or anything like that, but if you need one, you have to buy a whole assembly. This arm and this little pin inside of here are not serviced separately. So for the servo, there are several little parts. If you want to bring that a little closer, get this stuff out of the way. There is an O-ring. Yeah, all this. All right. So this is the piston. Like with all things, lots of lube. Get everything all oiled up. Inside and out. Okay. So these two pieces slide over each other like so. You'll see the two slots. One turns inside the other. The piston will drop down inside. Oop, well, that wasn't supposed to happen, but either way, the piston goes inside like that. This goes on here. This O-ring goes in this groove. If it'll cooperate, slick fingers. And make sure she's nice and square on there. We flip this guy over. And this is kind of a tight fit. And then you'll have to snap it in there on that O-ring. I've never torn an O-ring in one of these. It's a good quality little unit. There's 2 retaining ring grooves. So your bottom one, get your retaining ring on there. Then you got this guy, which we did not lubricate. And when you bring it down on there, you have to align this arm into the side of that as you bring it down. That has to be connected or your stuff ain't going to work. So, spring, little top hat guy. Try not to lose control of everything. Compress your spring, get your upper ring on there. And you have a functioning throttle servo. So now the servo has to be connected to the rack, and this is kind of the tricky part, and I have screwed this up myself in the past and found out my pump, you know, wouldn't fuel because I had it pushed all the way forward and it wouldn't pull it into fuel. So the arm on this servo has to attach here, and then when you install it, it has to attach here also in this groove. And it also has to hook onto the rack. So several things have to be connected at the same time. And red Loctite, my favorite, at least for some of this stuff. Some people really abuse red Loctite because we don't want this guy coming loose either. So there is a dowel here, and it'll locate this thing to its proper place. But what you're trying to do is you want to take this and push it to the rear and get this slot where you can see it, and that slot is going to hook the rack. Just that slot in the rack and this hook, this has to hook this. So you just kind of wiggle it and we're hooked, and then we pull this back and we rotate that arm into place and we're on the housing. And there's a way to verify you did this right here in a minute. Get your, oops, that's a dowel hole. Get your bolts in there. You want these Guten tight. Okay. Now you can grab right here, and you're moving everything, including your flyweights. Everything is traveling. And to make sure you are hooked to your rack, you want to look in this hole right here. You can see that I am physically moving the rack from the servo. So we're hooked to the rack. We don't have it shoved in all the way. Our pump isn't going to not work when we go to try to start this thing. It is functioning. So it's hooked up correctly. We got our little arm and our 2 little slots. We can move on. So now that we got all that on there, we can put the middle section of the governor housing on. It has 2 bolts that hold it in place until the rear section is on, then it sandwiches it all together and it can't go anywhere. When you clean these surfaces and stuff, no roll-lock discs, no wire wheels. So many people ruin housings by not cleaning properly. Just scrape the gasket carefully and then hand sand it to get rid of like any glue or something somebody may have put on there. And just put a gasket on. You don't need a mountain of silicone or any of that stuff. You should know how to helicoil. If you're working on these pumps, this back housing is aluminum. And 9 out of 10 of these, somebody has stripped out a bolt somewhere in the back. Every time you go to do one, they're stripped out bolts. This is the fuel setting block, and I do not take these off or disassemble them either. There's no reason to. I've never seen a broken one or anything like that. This is where your horsepower would be set. How much fuel the engine gets under full fuel. So there's these 2 stop bolts. Cat calls this a torque spring, and basically this outer stud contacts the torque spring, and when you're under full throttle, oil assists in pulling this thing into full fuel, because as it's running, the flyweights are always trying to pull it out of fuel. So this has enough force, it'll contact the torque spring and it'll go just a little bit further, and this inner screw contacts a solid stop. And this solid stop is what determines how much fuel the engine gets. Now, it's very simple. If you want more power, you simply back these out an equal amount. And if you have this off on the bench, you can set it pretty precisely to where it contacts the spring just a tiny bit before it contacts the solid stop. There's pumps out there that don't have these in there, and they go full fuel. But I don't recommend doing it that way. If you want more fuel, you simply back out the screws an even amount, and that'll give you more fuel. Some people say it's like a horsepower screw and a torque screw, and I don't know, all kinds of weird stuff like that. All this thing does is limit rack travel. That's all it does. There's no magic here. So we'll take our governor housing, put our brandy new gasket on there. And there are dowels. Ooh, that's a good point. I almost missed the dowels. This happened once. We have a hot water parts washing tank, and there are 4 dowels in this housing. 2 on each side. They locate this housing to the pump housing, and they locate the rear housing to this housing. If you wash this or during disassembly, whatever, verify you have all 4 dowels. I don't care if one got stuck here or there, but you need to have dowels in this location. Whether they're stuck in this housing or this, it doesn't matter. If this housing isn't in the exact right spot on those dowels, this can hang. And we had one once, the dowel disappeared, nobody noticed, and the throttle would stick. Not like wide open runaway or anything like that, but you could rev it up and it was very slow to come back down. And all that was wrong was this housing was off just a tiny bit, enough for this to drag. And anyway, it caused a throttle issue, which nobody wants an issue when they get done. So we'll put this on here. And I did this on a 3304 once, which uses almost the exact same parts as this, more or less. Same design. This little round doodad right here has to be on the front side of this. One time, I assembled a pump, and I just shoved this housing on, and I shoved it like this. Well, when you do that, it holds the engine in full fuel, and you do have a runaway situation. It was the scariest 15 seconds of my life, but I got her shut down. So, when you put this on, get the old flyweight scooched out of the way, and we got to go around this, not like this. 33 must be a little different, because somehow I pulled that off. I don't know how you could do it on this pump, but I did it. And you find your dowels, and what happens is when this thing goes into fuel, you want to come on this side, you can see it a little better. This guy right here contacts this, and that limits how far out it can pull the rack, which limits how much fuel those pumps will put out. There's not a lot of magic here. It's just simply a stop. So just make sure you're on the correct side, and when you wiggle this, you're pushing this forward, and you won't have a runaway condition when you get this thing put together. So we got our 2 hidden bolts. One goes here. One goes here. And these go into cast iron in the pump, so good and tight. So we're just going to verify that's good. All of our flyweights are in the correct position, which with the big washers is kind of hard to screw up. With the small washers, these can get flopped out and then they're on the wrong side. But if you're using the updated large washers inside of here, the flyweights have a real hard time escaping. So right now we got all that on there. Now we need to assemble the rear governor housing. So this fuel pump is out of a front end loader. It has a much different throttle shaft than the guys that are watching this for a truck. The rest of the pump on your truck is going to be the same as this. Short to timing advance. There are several different timing advances on truck engines. This one has more or less a fixed, not even an advance. It's just a, I don't know. It's strange. Never seen one like it. But anyway, this is the throttle shaft we use. And the reason it has this and it's different is because you have the option for manual shutdown with this throttle. This is the throttle shaft that will be in a truck. So we're obviously assembling a loader one, but for a truck, the assembly is exactly the same. You're just not going to have the steps to assemble this and the outside housing. The way everything works internally is literally identical. So, just so you know, I guess. Wait, I need this one. This is the rear housing, completely disassembled. Checked all the threads. All the threads look like they're going to run one more time. So we'll start off with this little plate that goes right here inside the housing. It is an oil reservoir for the dash pot. The dash pot is this little needle valve assembly. And what the dash pot does is it allows a very small amount of oil to go into this riser tube and these piston seals, and that oil in here helps control throttle reaction. So if we eliminated the dash pot or screwed it all the way shut and no oil was allowed to get in there, I've never done it, but the way I read it, you would have erratic throttle response, like let's say when you go from light throttle or heavy throttle to no throttle, the way the pump responds would be really erratic. And this, it's kind of a damper, or a shock of sorts. So we'll start by putting this in. There is a little baby gasket that goes in there, and you got to put it in the right way or it doesn't fit. There we go. And then this little plate. And then we got our 4 screws. And I am going to put just a dab of blue Loctite. Get our screws in there. Okay. So now we have to put the riser tube back in. And this is actually a critical dimension. So some people might be wondering that have messed with these pumps, why do you take the tube out? Well, there is a seal that goes in here. And it's the seal that seals the end of this shaft when this is all assembled. That lip seal sits in there. Some of these are in these housings super tight. Like when you go to drive them out, you got to get after it. And some of them, simply by reaching in the back of this tube, if you were changing the seal and tapping the seal out, will move this tube, which they shouldn't ever be that loose, but I have seen them that loose. So I pulled the whole tube out because there is an oil passage. The oil gets fed to the dash pot through this, or from the dash pot, I should say. So I like to get everything really clean. So there is a little blue lip seal that gets put in here, just flush with the top. I just use a little OTC bearing driver kit and tap that baby in there. If you're doing this on a truck, you're probably looking at this and saying, I have a shaft sticking out of here, and there is also another lip seal like this, same outside diameter, different inside diameter, and I have mixed these seals up before when I wasn't paying attention, putting it together. And anyway, the blue one is for this tube, but what this is on a truck, you'll have a shaft sticking out, is for mechanical shutdown. And if you had a pair of vice grips or the special handle from Caterpillar or whatever, it's a splined little shaft, sticks out about that far, and you could manually shut off fuel to the truck right there if you needed to. I've never seen it used in any truck application, but it's there. And there's more components that would go inside this housing. There's a shaft and a little block and a spring. We don't have any of that, so I'm not going to show you any of that. But I guess if you're doing a truck, you want to change that shaft seal, because even though they never move, they get rock hard over time and it will leak. But it's simple as removing a snap ring and then popping the spring off of one of these sides of the housing, and then you pull the shaft out, dig the seal out, tap a new seal in, away you go. So I'll put this shaft seal in. One thing to note, use caution when however you extract the seal. I usually use a long punch going through the back. There is a snap ring that rides in a groove just above that seal. So if you're going to drive that out with a punch, make sure you're driving the seal, not the snap ring. The snap ring is required. It has to stay in there because it's part of what loads this throttle shaft. And anyway, things won't work properly. So we got the seal in there. One of the most critical things to do for assembling this is the depth of this tube. When you reinstall it, you have to be 464 thousandths below this machine surface. So what I do, I had a wide depth mic. It got destroyed, dropped, whatever. But what I do now is I use a machined, slightly dirty, straight edge. I measure the thickness of the straight edge, and then I add 464 thousandths. I know it's a little redneck, but it works. Until I get another depth mic. I will lay this across here. I'll drive the tube down a little ways. 464 thousandths is almost a half an inch, so you can get it started to where it's below surface and you're not obviously sitting on it. So you'll add this dimension plus 464 and come off the edge of this down to the edge of this tube to set your depth. So I'll get this started in here and get my math figured out, and we'll drive that tube in there to the proper depth. So I got the tube started in there. Lay my straight edge across here. And my dimension, so the thickness of this plus 464 thousandths below this machine surface is 0.754. That's my dimension. Yours may be different depending on how you do this. Or you have the right tool and you just lay a very wide depth mic here and you go down 464. But we'll hang off the edge and I'll just set that on there. And we're still probably about 1/8 of an inch high. This is also an art, not a science. I like to bring it out on the edge of the table, so when I strike it, to drive it in there, I'm striking on this, and you're not flopping around. You have a flat surface that you're tapping against. So now my tube is installed 464 thousandths below this surface. Moving on to what is next. Okay. This little lever gizmo is what is going to end up pushing right here. And it's part of air-fuel control. And air-fuel control is right over there in 1,000 small pieces, which we'll assemble later. But what you're doing is you're just installing this back in the housing where it goes. There's this, a shaft, and 2 spacers of different dimensions, which sets where this sits in the housing. And oil again. Everybody likes oil. Oil in there. Oil in there. So in this application, and probably all of them, I don't know, you guys have to look. The thick washer goes on first. Get that over here where you can see it better, sorry. Ah, crap. You gotta hang on to these, they're kind of slick. Okay, so now we have our thick spacer on this side, our thin spacer on this side, and this guy is just flopping and hanging out. So what you're doing is you're centering with the offset spacers, you're centering this, I shouldn't say centering, but you're moving it to where all the way over it's centered on the hole for the air fuel control to come in and hook onto it. If you had this one on this side, it'd be too far this way, and this shaft would be crooked trying to hook onto it, which we'll go over that in a minute. Okay. So if this was truck application, it would be very simple. You would drive a shaft seal in this hole. Almost forgot. Once you put all this stuff in, there is a plug with an O-ring that goes right there. That holds it all from falling out. Truck application, we'd put our seal in right here, which is the seal that rides on this part of the shaft. And then we would drop this in, and as we did, we would stack all of our components on there for throttle control. But this isn't truck, so we need to assemble our loader style shaft with mechanical shutdown, which is these parts. And I will get the clips pre-installed on that, and we'll throw this thing together and put it in our brand new housing, and we'll go from there. Ready? Okay, so I got my throttle shaft loader style assembled. This is, like I said, for manual shutdown. Truck application, we'll just use the other shaft. But if you're putting one of these together, this is your idle adjust. So if this is backed out all the way and you don't give any throttle when you're cranking on it, she ain't going to start because it's going to be a no fuel. So this is, you would adjust this in or out to set what low idle is or should be or whatever. This is a special nut. It is a sealing nut. If you just use a regular nut or whatever, it is going to leak oil out of this housing. And we go to install this. It's a little tricky. You got this piece you're sliding through, and then it has to, this little corner has to stay under that corner, and you start it into the other piece. Now it's started, and you see this piece is stuck underneath that piece, so when we turn this later, it's going to force that to lift up. And then here's the keyway, and here's a little baby key that will fit in there someday. And then you have to align the key with that keyway and keep it from wandering out at the same time. There we go. We got it start, the key is started through this and started into this piece. There's a key slot here and a key slot here. And then we'll align our housing. A little wiggle. There are two dowels that locate this. And there's a slot cut in the end of this shaft, if I had the old one, where this bolt has to pass through to make it fit. And if the bolt passes through, you're in the right location. Don't force it in there. There's a slot, yeah, everything's in the right spot. This will just fall in there and thread right in. I do recommend a little bit of red Loctite. Don't want anything in this pump wandering around. But now, when I apply throttle, if you look here, it's going to lift that, which in turn is going to push you into fuel. Now the rest of the parts are this little race here. Oil, lots of oil. We're going to put a little oil on this tube. You drop that down onto the fork, and then you have two wavy washers and just a machined washer, and there's a wavy washer on each side. Drop that down on there. Then your spring goes on there. And as far as internal parts in the rear governor housing, there are no more. Even the outside of this bearing, because it does fit pretty snug. And then we're going to lube the inside of this tube just for easier assembly. And then before you go to smash that thing on there, I like to make sure that all the housings are free of oil and stuff like that, so the gasket, you know, has a fighting chance of grabbing the first go around. Blue shop tails like to fall apart with brake cleans. It's not the best thing to use, but get anything off there you might have wiped off with your, or wiped on there with your hands. And position your rear gasket on the dowels. There is a whole heaping handful of bolts that holds all this together of several different lengths. So if it helps you, before you go to assemble, separate your bolt lengths so that you're not ramming too long of a bolt in too short of a hole. So these two are just a fuzz shorter. There we go. Okay, so throttle works, pushes, well, I should hold that, I guess. Pushes it up, that's what we're after. Bolt is tight, keyway is in. This guy's good. We put the plug in here to retain it. I don't have a mechanical shutdown up here, so there's nothing to show you there. Be careful of this little guy right here. This is what contacts the insulator, and you don't want to hook it and bend it all out of the way. Just kind of go around it. But you have to, this shaft has to go inside this tube. And there is a seal at the end, so you just want to do this very carefully. There we go. And then make contact with your dowels. Now, if I could get it to start on the bottom dowel. It's kind of sticky on the dowels, but if it wasn't so sticky, you would notice that this housing kind of wants to jump off of here. There is some spring tension. That's a good thing. That means, well, it means that your riser tube was installed at the correct height. Of course, you could have gone too far and it'd be really hard to get on there, but we covered that already. Two longest ones go right here. These two that are just a skosh shorter go from the pump housing back into the governor housing. And then you have four. All the same length. Go around the outside. I think one in that corner right here. So once you get them all in there and they're all snug, then just start going around in a circle and tightening them. So if you have electric shutdown, which this does, your electric shutdown solenoid goes right in this hole right here, and it'll push on one of these levers, and it will, if you look through this hole, let me pull it into fuel, it'll push the rack out of fuel like that. So now we can just put the remaining pieces on the back of the injection pump. Shutdown solenoid, which works backwards as to what's in a truck. In a truck, when you key on, this thing will shoot in. So at key off, a spring pushes it out and pushes into no fuel. In a loader, when you go key off, it actually energizes this and it shoots it out for a predetermined amount of time, then it clicks back in. So this is backwards is the way a truck one would work, but technically it still pushes on the rod and shuts it off. This is an updated gasket. This is a common thing to leak on the back of these. This is a 6i 2002 gasket. and it's steel with rubber. These generally don't leak. It was a good upgrade Cat came up with. So on this thing, actually before we put that on, we should put the dashpot needle and valve in. So there are 2 O-rings, and we'll lube this guy up a little bit. Thread him in there. And then we'll lube up our needle valve, O-ring. And this is an adjustment. So I always set these 1.5 turns backed out. That's kind of the amount of oil that it lets get into the riser tube. And every pump I've ever done was between 1.25 and 1.5 from the factory. So 1.5 turns is what I've always done. It's always worked. So you just thread it all the way in. Not really super tight. You just hit bottom, and then 1/2, 1 and 1/2, and it's set. Leave it alone. Nothing else to do there. This hole right here in truck application would probably have a jig switch sticking out of it, and that jig switch is how you would set what low idle was. You'd screw the jig switch in, it would raise the idle RPM, you back it out, it lowers RPM. You pull it all the way out, it won't run unless you're holding your foot on the gas. This is Cat's fix. If you don't have a jig switch with a sealing nut, you use a bolt and a copper washer. Yeah, that's not going to leak. So we'll go ahead and thread that in there because that's what they say to use. I forgot to get the O-ring for this, and I will I'll have to get one here in a little bit. But this is real simple. This is your tack drive cover. It just simply bolts on right here. It actually even says down with an arrow so that you orient it correctly. One thing I've seen on several pumps is this will leak back here, and there's actually a bleed hole. And so this shaft seal will fail. This will fill up with oil, or shouldn't fill up. It'll just start draining out this hole. So people are like, oh, that hole's leaking. So they just thread a plug into it. Don't do that. Just get it fixed properly, which would mean pulling the back section of the governor housing off just to change the seal if that's all you want to do, but that would fix it correctly. Don't thread plugs in there. I mean, you could be really cool. You could put a nipple on it, and you could just run it to your oil pan. That would be neat. But anyway, this little cover, which this is the access hole, so you can adjust how much fuel she gets. It's very simple, just a cover with 2 screws. And then right here is the plastic insulator, which is for checking full fuel setting, but nobody does that. I like to put, it's a plastic screw. It does come with some of this pink sealant stuff. I don't know. I like to put a little 5/18 on there just for good measure because I don't like leaks. And it threads down in here. Plastic, so once it hits bottom, just snug it a little bit, call it a day. This cover, I haven't talked about this screw. If you looked inside of here, the large throttle lever we installed in the governor housing before it was assembled, it pivots when you apply fuel, and it would run into this screw. And what this screw does is it sets your high RPM setting. So most trucks are governed at 2150 or 2250 or something like that, sometimes 1850. But if you wanted your B model to spin 3500 RPM, you take that screw out and throw it away. But I don't recommend touching that, messing with it. There's no reason a B model needs to be over 2000 RPM. There we go. And like I said, the shutdown solenoid goes here. Okay, Now, the last item that would go on here, besides obviously the cover I don't have an O-ring for right now, is air fuel control, which is that big pile of parts right there. And let me get it set up on the bench and I'll show you how to assemble it. Okay, so this is roughly how air fuel control is assembled in its exploded form. But you need, oopsie, you need to replace this little umbrella seal, which goes on here, and you gotta kind of fish it down in there and just work it around the outside. And then you'll see it's got like a flared edge that flares out like that. So we'll lube up this bore and this bore, but mainly this one down here. And we'll start this down in here. So what I like to do is I take, not this, take an O-ring pick. You gotta get to where you can see it. And you gotta kind of fish that seal around the edge a little bit. Oh, see, it tries to jump out of there on you. There we go. Because the seal is flared out and you're pushing it down, if you just smash it in there, you could flip the lips upward and then the seal wouldn't function properly. So when you start it in there, you just got to kind of tuck that outside edge as you kind of push on it and get it to jump down in there. And then you have a spring that's going to sit on top of that. And there are more. There are lots of springs in this guy. One of them is this little fella right here, and it goes inside that. And then you have to hook this barbell. You're going to compress the spring and hook this little barbell guy in on top of it. There we go. And you can see the spring is underneath, and this is pushing on that spring. Always change the diaphragm. Oh, look at that score. Caterpillar sent me 2 diaphragms. Right on. So you only need one. Just put one in there. Diaphragm will sit on top. This little retaining cap goes like that. That spring will sit on there, which we'll get to that in a second. This cap, spring goes on here. A lot of pieces to assemble all at the same time. So that is your stack. Big wiry spring, cup, small tight spring, little barbell in there with its spring, diaphragm, another spring, and the lid. The lid is orientated. It only goes on one way, as far as this way or this way. So if you compress all this, you do have to guide the barbell into this piece here. So as you go down, you have to look in there and guide it down into that hole. There it goes. And I have the housing on backwards, of course, so just give that a spin. The diaphragm makes the oil seal, that lip on the diaphragm. And you gotta hold on to it and get a couple of bolts in there. So now I got the bolts in there holding all those springs down. Then you can usually just take 2 fingers and compress it and get your bolts in the rest of the way. Or I guess you can pull it down with the bolts too. Sounds right. This is a filter that goes in this hole right here, because oil does go to this, and it assists it in operating. You can just shove it down in there. There's a fat blue O-ring, a skinny light blue O-ring, a yellow O-ring, and another yellow O-ring. All those you stick in the housing and just leave them in the housing with some lube on them. The large one you want to put on the air fuel control itself with some oil. And then you have two long bolts that will hold it on there. Now, the air fuel control has two ports. Well, okay, let's just say 3 holes here and 2 holes here. So the 3-hole section goes down here, 2-hole section goes up here. There's a fork in there, and what we're doing is we're going to come in at an angle, and we're going to hook this around the fork so that this can pull on it. So you don't just jam it straight in there. You got to kind of come in high and hook that fork. Sometimes you got to reach in and pull the fork back a little bit just to kind of help you out. But go in. Didn't get it. Okay, so now I got it. I'm stuck in the fork. I reached in there and I can pull, and it doesn't want to come out, and it's got some travel to it. So we know we're in the fork. So now just go straight forward. It's located properly. And get your bolts in. And then the last thing would be your air fuel control cap, which would be bolted on here. And then the steel line from this would go up to your intake manifold, and boost pressure, manifold pressure, goes into this, and it goes in and it pushes on the diaphragm, and it allows that to travel out of the way so that the rack can be pulled into fuel. The whole purpose of an air fuel control is so you don't have massive black clouds of smoke off idle, so you can't just floor it and it just yards the rack into full fuel. So yeah, this just hooks up and the hose goes the intake manifold, and real simple. The only thing left on the pump that we have not done is put a couple covers on with some O-rings. That's pretty self-explanatory. Same thing with this. This just has a large gasket, bolts on here. Every application usually has some spacers or something to hold fuel lines and things like that. These 2 ports, this is normally fuel in, this is normally fuel out, almost every application I've seen. It doesn't matter which is which, they go to the same place. You could do fuel in here and fuel out here, but one thing to pay attention to is your inlet is almost always a number 6 JIC, and it's a full flow fitting. Your outlet, like this is O-ring face, and it may look like a normal O-ring face fitting, but if we were to take it off and shine a flashlight in it, that has a needle of a hole through it. So this is actually a restriction fitting so that the pump can build pressure in this housing. If you put if this gets dropped, broke, something, you just get a regular fitting from a, hose and fitting place, it will have too much flow and you will not be able to maintain pump pressure. So this is a special fitting that you should get from Caterpillar. Don't just put a regular old fitting in there. And matter of fact, if somebody's worked on your pump or your truck and that got changed at one time, which we have seen before, and you can't build fuel pressure and you've put 9 lift pumps on it and fuel lines and everything else, this could be your issue. You need to make sure that's just got a little tiny hole drilled through it. I mean, like 3 needles stacked together. You know what I mean? There's not much room. The timing advance, or lack thereof, on this thing, on a truck, normally there'd be a lot more parts to this advance, but since I don't have one here, we're not gonna go over that. Timing advance assembly for this thing is extremely simple. There's a quad ring here, and a quad ring here, and a quad ring inside of here. And you stack those pieces together and you're done. The timing advance style, like on a truck, would have flyweights and a spool and a top hat and springs and all kinds of stuff in there, and I don't have one to show you right now, so we're going to skip that. So the only thing we didn't do during this whole assembly was torque these bonnets. I did tell you earlier it's 190 foot-pounds, and I have not finished torqued these. Caterpillar does make a really cool jig that bolts to the front of this, and you stick it in a vise, and basically the pump sits hanging there from the vise. I'll probably just torque these down when I put it on the engine. Just do the finished torque, and the engine can hold the pump in place. I have actually put this pump body in the vise before. It actually doesn't fit too bad, and you can just torque them there. But that's the only thing we didn't do. I guess that's it. Okay, here goes. I'm gonna have to back out my idle screw. So that pretty much concludes the video. If you guys want to see anything else, like or tips on how to time one of these, or you swap pumps off something else and you can't get it timed, Cat does have some really fancy tooling for setting exact timing. I do it by sound, how they start, how much they smoke, if it's the timing's retarded or advanced. You can, if you've been around these engines enough, you can tell if there's a timing issue just by listening to them. And like giving it throttle when it's cold, how it runs, things like that. But yeah, thanks for watching.